Hello, welcome to this segment. Today we have the privilege of speaking to Chris Powell. He's the Assistant Director of the PMO at the University of Washington. Chris, welcome back. We talked to you earlier in this segment and some of the other segments as well. Today's focus is on competency developments for PMs and different practitioners, product owners, and Scrum Masters. So I'm just going to start off with one of the kind of initial questions. What competencies do you look for example, in a project management practitioner?
The answer to that question is really, really quite long, and probably more than we have time for, but I would like to try to sort of summarize it a little bit. I previously mentioned a prior employer where we had a kind of a formalized process, and in that formalized process there were between 2.5 and 30 different competencies that we tracked for project managers. And that's why I say that there's probably more of this than that we want to talk to. However, I think we can sort of break that or sort of condense that down to maybe 4 things. Yeah. So I think kind of the first thing that I look for in project managers is kind of technical competence, and there's sort of a range of things that applies to. I think there needs to be some amount of familiarity with, although not necessarily expertise in the domain that the project is executing in. So if you're creating an IT system, you need to know something about IT systems, and you don't have to be a developer necessarily. Right. You don't have to be a database guy, but you do have to know something about what they're doing, because you need to be able to understand and make decisions about that. I think as well, you need to understand a little bit about the solution technology. So if you're using a particular technology to solve the problem, you need to understand a little bit about that and make sure that those are matching with the problem domain issues that you're trying to solve. And then the third piece of that is really around the methodology that you're going to use to manage the project. And in that, I look for somebody to be the subject matter expert at that. That is the bread and butter of a project manager. You really need to be kind of aces at that piece of it. And for me, to be an expert at that, it's not about just sort of knowing what the steps are, right? You can't just say, I'm a Scrum Master, I've got my certification, therefore I know everything about doing the Scrum process. It's really a deeper understanding. What are all the pieces of that methodology intended to do? How do you apply those in any given situation? You really need to be able to make decisions about those things. And to do that, you really have to have a very deep understanding of what they're about and what they're for. So that's kind of the technical aspect of it. Kind of the next piece of it is people skills. And then there's a huge range of things associated with people skills, but it's obviously the ability to communicate effectively and to do this kind of translation function between your technical people and your business people. Yeah. Lots of different kinds of soft skills. Being able to understand what forms of communication work with particular audiences, and being able to jump between different kinds of media for being able to communicate. How to get people to do things, how to motivate people, how to negotiate deals with people. All of those different kinds of elements really play together, all of those soft skills together kind of under that banner of people management or people skills. Sure. I think that then the next two are kind of almost personal attributes as much as competencies. So obviously, as I said earlier, the project managers are problem solvers. That's kind of who we are by nature, but you have to be good at that to be a good project manager. And so, some people test for that by giving you puzzles to solve to see if you're good at it. But I mean, obviously, it's the ability to understand what's key about a problem, what kind of the key features of a problem are, and then helping yourself or the team kind of get to the place of understanding how to solve that. And then kind of the personal attribute side of it, kind of an attention to detail, a personal drive to not let ambiguity stay, being comfortable with ambiguity to start, but being willing to drive to resolution of ambiguity, to resolution of issues in the team, and sort of not be satisfied until you work through those things.
Yeah, those are all Those are all really important competencies. When you're hiring, for example, it's a project manager or a program manager, portfolio manager, or even a scrum master, product owner, do you see more differences in those roles, those competencies, or do you tend to see more overlap, similarities? And if you can maybe speak to a little bit, if there's anything in your mind that jumps out as maybe that's unique to any one of those particular roles, or that's more common, maybe you could articulate that a little.
So I think I would say a strong degree of overlap between the traditional project manager and the Scrum Master role. I think they're very similar kinds of roles, and I think certainly the technical skills, the people management skills, all of those things really apply pretty equally well to both kinds of roles. In my own experience, I've seen perhaps differences of scale or focus in those. In that, we define a kind of ideal project size when we talk about Scrum, and so that has certain kind of boundaries, and it kind of makes it a little bit easier maybe for a person in the Scrum Master role, whereas we don't define those kinds of boundaries for project managers typically, and they can go all the way from very small projects to very large projects, and those will require kind of different levels of the skills. I think kind of the bigger the project gets, kind of the better you have to be at some of the soft skills, for example. I think some of the other roles like business stakeholders and product owners, I think they can be substantially less aware of the methodology than a project manager or a Scrum Master could be. I mean, they have to know the part of it that they're responsible for doing, but they don't really have to understand the whole thing and what all the elements of it are. But they must be, obviously, experts at their own specific domain. So the business strategy part that you talked about, you expect your product owner to be a complete expert at that, and to be able to answer any and all questions that the project team might have about, why do we do this process the way we do it? Why would we want to do it differently? If we do it differently, what's the impact to the business? Is that going to be helpful, or is that not going to be helpful? And all those kinds of assessments that help you in prioritizing, if you're prioritizing a product backlog, or thinking of it just in terms of scope containment in a more waterfall project. Those kinds of decisions you want those stakeholders to be able to make, and they need to be able to make it based on what the business needs and wants. My experience of kind of the program management level and even portfolio management is that it requires kind of more of that business strategy awareness and knowledge than you might have at the project manager level. And so if I were to try and sort of translate that into the Agile world, I think like a Scrum Master at the kind of individual team level probably doesn't need to have that kind of skill set as much. They would probably rely more on the product owner to do that. But I think if you sort of scale that up and you talk about scrums or something like that, I would expect that at the higher level Scrum, again, you're going to expect that person to have kind of deeper insight into the business strategy, the business processes, and being able to converse kind of more at that business level than specifically at the technical individual team level.
And then at the portfolio level, competencies for somebody at that level. What do you look for in somebody in that role as opposed to maybe somebody is at an individual team level or maybe at a program level now?
If I was going to pick out kind of one competency set that I think is like more critical at the portfolio level than it is at any other level, and it's not that it's not critical at the other level, but I think the one that is like defines the portfolio manager job is the one of negotiation, and getting people to be able to compare two disparate kinds of things and decide which one is more important than the other, and to be able to go through and stack rank a backlog, or decide that we're going to do a project and not going to do a project, or we're going to reduce scope on this project so that we've got the bandwidth to do this other thing. It's all about understanding the business value that those different options bring to the teams, and sort of helping measure and make explicit to the decision makers the value of doing any particular body of work, and getting them to recognize that and make decisions on it. I think that sort of measuring and making explicit and getting people to negotiate about those things, and hard questions usually about what the trade-offs are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you start to, especially at the portfolio level, looking at defining what the actual work is and aligning it to strategy, and then you get into the authorization of the work. There's a lot that goes into prioritizing that portfolio to ensure that the right work's being done at the right time. Yeah. And at a smaller scale, you can look to then at a team level, a product owner in a backlog having to make prioritization decisions. Right?
Yes, and I think in the context of kind of a Scrum setting, right, it's a smaller conversation, right? Yeah. If you have a
team level, very focused,
a very team level, very focused, you can have this conversation kind of between the Scrum Master and the product owner, and it can be kind of an over the table or over coffee kind of conversation. When you get to the portfolio level, it's a room full of people. There's all these competing interests. There's big amounts of money involved, and so it's kind of more of a UN negotiation kind of scenario as opposed to something you can do over coffee.
Yeah. What do you do? And we talked about this a little bit earlier, to develop somebody that maybe is at a team level and they want to get to a program level, or you're at a program level and you want to go to a portfolio level?
I think it's very similar perhaps to kind of the difference between being a team leader and being a manager of a department, right? It's sort of similar kind of transition, and it's an ability to sort of step back from the lowest level of detail and to trust the people on your team.
Delegation's really important, huh?
Trust the people on your team to be able to do those things, and to sort of be a little bit lighter-handed in terms of guiding them and sort of letting them be successul at managing.
That's a hard skill for some people.
And so I think there's the same kind of thing, right? As you move up to the program level, you're not the project manager anymore. So you have to let the project managers do their job and be successful at it. And you have to be, therefore, better able at setting the goals for them. How are we going to measure success on each of the projects in this program? How are we going to, do the relationship with the business across this collection of projects that comprise this program, and make sure that all of their needs are met, that we're not siloing too heavily on one of the projects versus another. I think then as you make the transition to a portfolio manager, again, it's that same sort of level of abstracting yourself kind of one level further. And so at the portfolio level, it's probably most important to get deeply embedded in the business and to really spend almost all of your time on the business relationships and making sure that you really understand what the business wants to do, learning their business so that you can actually start to provide strategic guidance to them in a way that's meaningful, that might be novel, that they won't have thought of themselves.
Yeah, those are really good examples. I think going from that project to that program level, there's a lot more decision-making, prioritization, you're dealing with a lot more scale. You're not managing each individual project like you talked about. You're really there more in a supportive role for those particular PMs. Well, thank you very much. Chris, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.